They always said her nose would get her into trouble. No one guessed it would nearly get her killed. Did. Some people feel danger. She could smell it. And on that night, it reeked of something rotten, something not entirely human. You can run from a man, but can you ever escape someone who already knows where you sleep? Her apartment was supposed to be her safe haven. Instead, it became the hunting ground. By the time she locked the door, he already knew which stairs to climb, which hallway to walk, and which heart to break. Some people hear danger. Others see it. She smelled it long before it had a face. Her friends always joked about her overly sensitive nose. They teased her about the weird habits she'd developed, carrying peppermint oil in her purse to ward off the world's odors, refusing to step into certain stores because they smelled like mildew or synthetic leather. It was a quirk, a mild inconvenience, until it wasn't. That evening, the sky was warm with gold. Streets basked in soft amber, and the ocean breeze teased the corners of her jacket. If peace had a color, it was the one that coated her town that day. But peace was a lie. She had been walking home from her job at a local bookstore, the kind that still smelled of ink and old paper. Her car was in the shop again, something about a belt or valve. She didn't care. She hated driving anyway. Public transit was an option, but it was summer, and the thought of a humid bus filled with body spray and sweat made her skin crawly. So she walked. That was her mistake. At first, she thought it was the tide. The town, after all, made its living from the sea. Fishing vessels came and went. The scent of brine and barnacle was just part of the rhythm of the coast. But this wasn't brine. It was darker, rotten, like something that had been dead too long and forgotten under the sun. She slowed down near the old marina gates, pretending to tie her shoe, her senses flaring. And there it was again, the thick, nauseating stench of decaying fish. Not just a whiff, a cloud. And it moved. She straightened slowly, pretending not to notice. But her eyes darted, scanning. It was subtle at first, but then she saw him. A figure, shuffling in rhythm with her footsteps, always keeping the same distance behind. Maybe 30 feet, maybe less. He wasn't just walking, he was watching. He wore a waterproof fishing coat, despite the heat. His beanie clung to his head, low and soggy, as if it had recently been soaked. And in one hand, he carried a large fabric bag. The base was darkened, dripping something viscous onto the sidewalk. She saw the stains behind him, a trail, like something wounded. But he wasn't limping, not exactly. It was more like he didn't know how to walk right. She ducked into a side alley, pretending to scroll her phone. Her heart thudded. Maybe she was paranoid. Maybe. No. There he was. He had stopped too. She resumed walking. So did he. Turned left. He turned left, stopped under a flickering street lamp. He paused a beat later, kneeling to fiddle with his shoelace. That wasn't a coincidence. She felt her stomach drop. She was being followed. Her building was 2 blocks away, a compact 3-story place with narrow hallways and even narrower stairs. Not the kind of building that made you feel vulnerable. Not until now. The street was quiet. Too quiet. No dig walkers. No cars passing. No one to scream to. She gripped her keys between her fingers, a trick she'd read online once when browsing late-night self-defense tips. Keys like claws. Not that she had any idea how to use them. She was not brave, not prepared, just scared. The final block stretched like a nightmare hallway. Her footsteps quickened. She didn't look back. Couldn't. When she reached her door, she jammed the key in, heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. She flung the door open, stepped in, slammed it shut, and twisted the lock so hard the bolt screeched. But she stood there, breath caught in her throat, silent. Peering through the living room window, she saw him, just standing there. Not at the door, not even on her porch, across the street. Still, watching, like he was waiting for something to end. Or bet he didn't knock, didn't move closer, just shibited. And then, without warning, he turned and drifted down the street, bag in tow, dragging a line of wet filth behind him. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, it all felt distant, surreal, a dream blurred by sunlight. She told the building superintendent. He was kind to a retired Navy guy who always smelled like tobacco and engine grease. He told her the locks were good. No one could get in. She wanted to believe him. 3 days passed. Her car was still in the shop. Every evening, she walked with her head down and a small can of pepper spray clutched tight in her hoodie pocket. But the man didn't return. The air was clean. The streetlight worked again. No fish. No wet footprints. Maybe it had been a fluke here. Maybe he wasn't following her after all. By the 4th day, she even laughed about it with her friend on the phone. Called him Fish Bag Freddy. She shouldn't have laughed, because on the 5th night, she woke up to the smell. She snapped awake like surf crashing against a cliff. Sudden, loud in her own mind, even though the room around her was quiet. Not quiet in a peaceful way. Quiet in the kind of way that made you strain your ears to make sure you were still alive. And then she knew that smell. Not just foul, not just rotten. It was the exact same rancid, sea-soaked death she'd caught in the air days ago. Only now, it wasn't in the wind or behind her on the sidewalk. It was inside her eye. It drifted through the small gaps under her bedroom door. It clung to her sheets like damp salt. Her stomach turned, and for a moment she couldn't tell if it was fear or nausea. Maybe both. She lived alone. No roommates, no visitors, no excuse for that smell to be there, unless she slid out of bed in silence. Years of tiptoeing past creaky floorboards during teenage curfews suddenly served her well. Her hand reached instinctively under the bed. The bat was there. Her brother had given it to her when she moved. A faded red Louisville Slugger with his initials etched near the handle. It was a joke at first, a gesture of protection. But now it was her only defense. She crept toward her bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Keat. She cracked it open. Still nothing. But the smell was stronger now. She padded barefoot into the hallway, heart thumping like a warning drum. The apartment was cloaked in darkness, except for a thin line of moonlight spilling in through the window above the kitchen sink. Then, from the living room, a soft schloop, like something heavy and wet being dropped onto wood. Her mouth went dry. And another sound, rustling, wet and thick. She stepped forward and saw him. He was standing in her living room, his back to her. The bag was at his feet, still leaking, and he was whispering, not to her, but to whatever was inside it. She froze. He hadn't broken anything, hadn't ransacked her drawers, hadn't even turned on a light. He was just there, as if he belonged. Then, without warning, he dropped down, not like a drunk collapsing, but like a toddler sitting cross-legged for story time. He rummaged into the bag, pulling out something slick and gray, muttering as if greeting an old friend. Her brain refused to comprehend what she saw. Fish. Dozens of them. Dead, decayed, their eyes clouded over. He ran his fingers along their scales. He looked delighted. She took one step back, and her heel nudged the corner of the hallway table. The lamp on it wobbled. She grabbed it just in time, but not before it scraped the wall. He didn't move, didn't look back, didn't speak. She held her breath and stepped into the kitchen. Her phone lay on the counter, charging. She snatched it, then darted for the bathroom, the only other room with a lock, and the bolt slid into place with a whisper. She called 911. "I think he's inside," she whispered. "He followed me days ago, and now he's here. He's in my living room." "What's your address?" the operator asked. "Are you in a safe location?" "Yes, bathroom. Locked. But I don't know for how long. He broke in somehow." The operator kept her on the line, asking calm, measured questions. Anything to keep her grounded. But the only thing grounding her now was fear. Footsteps outside. Slow, dragging. They stopped. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sound of her breathing. Then came a faint thud, like something leaning against the door. The smell seeped through the cracks. It made her eyes water. "I think he's right outside," she whispered. "Oh, God. Oh, God. He's right." "Ma'am, officers are on their way. Stay on the line. Do not open that door." Well, she didn't plan to. Another sound. Metal on porcelain. Was he fiddling with the doorknob? No, he was just there, silent, unmoving, waiting. Then voices. From outside, shouting, "Police!" She didn't hear him run. She didn't hear him speak. She just heard chaos, heavy boots, something crashing, a scuffle that echoed through the floor. Then silence, then a knock. "Ma'am, this is Officer Rivera. You're safe now. You can come out." When she opened the door, the smell hit her like a wave. The man was gone, but the bag remained, slumped in the middle of her floor like a corpse of its own. The fish had spilled out, too many for one man to carry casually. Some looked ancient. Others glistened with filth and insects. The police covered their noses with gloves and grimaces. One officer quietly gagged in the hallway. A lamp was broken. A framed movie poster lay shattered on the floor. But other than that, the apartment looked untouched, unharmed. But she knew better. The damage wasn't in what he broke. It was in how close he had come. In the weeks that followed, the pieces came together. He was a fisherman, once proud, once sober. But storms had ruined his boat, and grief had ruined his mind. He lost his wife, then his son, then his way. He'd been seen around the harbor muttering to fish, swearing they whispered back. Locals had dismissed him as another casualty of bad luck and bad booze. But no one knew how far gone he truly was. This was his first break-in. Maybe he wasn't trying to hurt her. Maybe he just wanted to show someone his collection. Maybe she reminded him of someone he once loved. She didn't want to know. She moved out 2 weeks later, far side of town. New locks, new landlord, but the smell followed her in dreams. She would wake at 1:30 a.m. on random nights. Sure, she'd caught a whiff of decay, just the memory. She'd tell herself, just fear rotting in her brain like old fish. But sometimes, just sometimes, she'd hear the floorboard creak outside the bathroom door. Her new apartment was on the second floor of a small building across town. Old but clean, with fresh paint and neighbors who said hello. She thought it would make her feel safe again. Thought wrong. The locks were better, the lights brighter. But none of it mattered, because it wasn't the door that scared her now. It was the dreams. Every night for a week after moving in, she woke at 1:30 a.m. sharp, as if summoned, as if her mind refused to let go of that hour. Some nights she could swear she still smelled it, that foul, fishy stench. She'd get up, flick on all the lights, throw open the windows. Nothing. Other nights, she dreamt of the bag, not the man, just the bag, sitting at the foot of her bed, shuddering like something inside was still alive. She started seeing a therapist, doctor, molten, calm, kind, always wore linen suits and asked questions without pressing. One day she asked him, "Why do I still smell it?" Weeks later, in a new place, he paused. Sometimes trauma anchors itself to a sensory trigger. In your case, smell. So I am imagining it. Not quite. You're reliving it. Your brain thinks that scent means danger, so it conjures it. That helped for a while, until one night, while taking out the trash, she noticed something, a dark smear along the alley wall behind her new building. Thick, wet, like fish guts. But she never walked that way again. One afternoon, her former building superintendent called her. "You okay?" he asked. "Sir." She hesitated. "Yeah. Why? You remember that guy? The one with the fish?" Of course she remembered. Well, strange thing. A tenant saw someone that looked like him last week. Just standing outside the building, not doing anything. Just standing. "But he's in the hospital," she said. "Right. Should be. But the cop said he didn't check in like he was supposed to. Place was supposed to transfer him. Something about insurance." She felt the color drain from her face. Just wanted to let you know," he added. In case what?" But he had already hung up. She started researching. It didn't take long to find his name in old arrest records. Dean Carroll, once a third-generation fisherman, had a son. Lost him in a boating accident 5 years ago. Wife left a year later. After that, things spiraled. Neighbors reported him talking to fish. Once tried to baptize a crab. Another time, he stood chest deep in the harbor, muttering for hours. No one helped him. No one stopped him until he found her. But what shook her most wasn't what he did. No, it was what he said when police took him in. Words buried in the arrest report. He kept mumbling, "The sea sent me. She called me to bring the dead things back." 1 month later, she received a letter. No return address. The envelope smelled like seawater. Inside was a single page, handwritten, shaky. You heard it too, didn't you? That hum in the walls, that smell in the night. It wasn't me. I was just the net. She is still in the water. She remembers you. There was no signature. You do? Just a crude ink drawing of a bag. Open, and something crawling out of it. She moved again. This time, inland. Far from the coast. Far from boats and tides and the smell of fish. She told herself it was over. He was gone. Locked away or drowned. She didn't care. But every so often, a package would show up outside her door. No label, no postmark, just a wet brown stain on the box. She never opened them. Once, curiosity almost won. But then she remembered what the bag smelled like. How it sounded when he squished it between his hands. How the fish had eyes that didn't seem quite dead. And she left the box out in the rain until it melted into mush. Years passed. She rebuilt her life. Kept a bat by every door. Slept with the windows shut tight. Refused seafood, even in restaurants. But sometimes, walking through a grocery store, she'd pass the seafood aisle and freeze. Her body remembered sudden, the weight, the smell, the stillness of someone too quiet, and worse, she still dreamed of the bag. Only now, it talked, thought. He thought he found the one. But one night in her apartment, everything shattered, literally. 2 masked men, a knife, a baton, and a woman who didn't seem surprised. They didn't rob her. They didn't touch her things. They only came for him. Was this love or a setup? And worse, what if it was both? It took him years to realize the truth, but by then, the damage was permanent. There's a difference between a good feeling and a gut warning. They both hum in your chest. Only one of them is lying to you. It all started the way so many modern love stories do, with a swipe. He hadn't expected much when he opened Tinder that night. Mostly boredom, maybe a dopamine hit. But then there was her. Kara, not overly filtered. No duck face, just bright eyes, a messy bun, and a quote in her bio about Vonnegut. Her first message wasn't, "Hey." It was a sarcastic reply to his pizza emoji opener. They went from clever banter to philosophical tangents faster than he could process. She was smart, witty, fast. By the 3rd night of messaging, he was checking the app like a teenager. By the end of the week, they'd moved to texting. She sent voice notes. Her voice was warmer than he expected, calmer, like someone who didn't need to prove anything. They met in person a few days later. Coffee first, no pressure. He arrived early, sat by the window of a cozy little cafe tucked between a bookstore and a nail salon. She was right on time. No dramatic entrance, no playing it cool. Just walked in, spotted him, smiled. That was all it took. They talked for hours. Not just polite first date stuff, but real conversation. Family, childhood nicknames, or first heartbreaks, their biggest fears. He remembered looking at her fingers wrapped around the coffee mug and thinking, please don't let this be a fluke. And it wasn't. We clicked really well over chat and met up for a few dates. The second date was dinner. The third, a walk through a dimly lit park where she tucked her arm into his without asking. It felt natural, warm, like he'd known her longer than a week. And by the fourth date, he knew he wanted more, not just intimacy, more time, more conversation, more of whatever they were building. And then came the fifth, dinner and a movie. Now, after a few dates, the girl, I'll just call her Kara, shyly asked me if I'd like to stay over at her place after we'd been out to dinner and the movies. She was blushing when she asked, but her eyes held confidence. It wasn't a trap. It felt earned, like an invitation he'd already passed a dozen unspoken tests for. He said yes. Kara's apartment was in a quiet part of town. Nothing fancy, just clean and inviting. There were plants on the windowsill, stacks of books under her coffee table, a record player by the TV. She lived like someone who didn't pretend to be interesting. She just was. They ate Thai food, watched an old noir film she loved, and shared a bottle of red wine. He couldn't remember much of the movie, but he remembered the weight of her head on his shoulder and the way she looked at him when the credits rolled. I don't remember what movie we saw, but I remember enjoying it. They kissed, then kissed more. Her hand found his, and without saying a word, she led him to her bedroom. The rest was soft lighting and quiet laughter. We'd only held hands and kissed a bit previously, but that night we got straight to it, so to speak. She smelled like lavender and something citrusy. Her skin was washed, her voice low. They didn't rush. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, intimate. One of those rare nights where you feel like a human being instead of just a body. It was one of the best nights of my life. They lay tangled in each other afterward, the only light in the room coming from a string of fairy lights above the headboard. He remembered thinking how peaceful everything felt. Then sleep took them. He didn't remember slipping into unconsciousness, just that he went from bliss to blackness in a blink. The sound woke him. Not a soft noise, not a bump in the hallway, a crack, like the universe had snapped its fingers and shattered something sacred. His eyes opened fast. Glass shattered. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed. Fast footsteps. He was still tangled in sheets, body heavy with sleep and wine. For a second, he thought he was dreaming. Then the figures appeared, two of them, dark clothes, hooded, masks. One had something shiny in his hand, a knife. The other held what looked like a steel baton. His heart sprinted. I was stunned and had no idea how to react. But he tried to speak, maybe shout, but no sound came out. Everything after that happened in jerks and flashes. The taller one grabbed him, pulled him out of bed. The floor was freezing under his bare feet. Hands shoved him forward. Kara sat up, eyes wide, but not screaming. Why wasn't she screaming? They manhandled me out of the bed and dragged me into the living room. He stumbled. The shorter figure pushed him into a dining chair. Rough rope, wrist behind the back, ankles tied to chair legs. It was fast. Too fast, like they'd done it before. He saw the knife glint near Kara's face. But still, no panic. She didn't move, didn't cry, just stood near the wall, breathing hard. Why weren't they touching her? Why was it just him? That was the moment it hit him. Not fear, doubt. Something here didn't make sense. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you and watches. The ropes bit into his wrists. The chair creaked beneath his weight. He wanted to scream, to shout, to beg, but all he could do was breathe and shake. The two intruders didn't speak at first. They moved in sync, practiced, efficient. One was rifling through his overnight bag. The other stalked around the room, occasionally glancing at Kara, who now sat silently on the edge of the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her expression was unreadable. That struck him as strange. They hadn't gagged her. They hadn't tied her up. They hadn't even yelled at her. Just brought her out of the bedroom like she was a guest at her own nightmare. The taller man found the watch in his bag. It was a gift from his father. Silver. Heavy. Elegant. The man held it up, inspecting it. "Real?" he asked, voice muffled beneath the mask. I told him it was fake. The man didn't argue. He dropped it into his duffel bag. Next came his phone. They unlocked it quickly. Kara was still in view, still untouched. They forced me to unlock my phone. The shorter one stepped behind him, resting the baton across his shoulders like a threat unspoken. It was enough. He tapped in the code with shaking fingers. They reset the password and handed it off. He could hear them tapping through his apps. Apple Pay, bank account, notes, messages. He felt violated in ways that went beyond the physical. But that wasn't what haunted him most. What haunted him was her. Kara hadn't moved. She sat quietly, her eyes occasionally flicking to him, then to the men. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't shout for them to stop. Why? They were actually pretty gentle with her, and I don't know why that just kept sticking in my mind. He noticed, and the noticing wouldn't go away. The shorter man pulled out his wallet, credit cards, ID, cash. The last photo he had of his sister and her kids ripped in half. No purpose, just cruelty. Just spiteful, angry robbers who wanted to upset me. But again, only him. They never touched Kara's bookshelf. Never peeked into her purse. Didn't open drawers or search for valuables. The apartment was left untouched. Except for him. His things, his identity, his fear. And as suddenly as they arrived, they left. The sound of the door slamming was the only goodbye. The quiet returned like a punch. Kara stood slowly and walked over to him. She touched the rope at his wrist, but hesitated. Her hands shook now. Tears finally welled in her eyes, but no sobs came. She untied him in silence. He didn't know what to say. Neither did she. They sat in the living room for 20 minutes before calling the police. The apartment felt colder, smaller, wrong. The officers came quickly. They were methodical, professional. One examined the broken glass. The other took statements. He told them everything he could, what they looked like, how they moved, what they said. His voice trembled, but he kept it together. Kara's statement was shorter. She said she hadn't seen much, that they'd broken in through a living room window. The officer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Later, in the hallway, one of them asked, "How long have you known her?" He hesitated. "A couple weeks." The officer nodded, expression unreadable. Dealing with the cops, I started to get more and more suspicious. It was a small moment, but it changed everything. The next morning, he called Kara. No answer. Texted her. Got a short reply. "I'm okay. Just tired." He asked about the window. She said she thought she'd locked it, but maybe she forgot. It didn't sit right. He asked why they didn't take anything of hers, why they hadn't even searched her place. Another short reply. "I don't know." He pushed harder. "It just seems strange that only my stuff was taken in." No response. Then, "Are you blaming me?" He froze. Was he? He typed out a reply. "No, of course not." Deleted it. Typed again. "I'm just trying to understand." Deleted again. Finally, he wrote, "It's incredibly convenient that only I was targeted." He hit send. Yeah, she didn't reply. It doesn't take much to break trust. Sometimes all it takes is a silence that arrives too quickly. He sat on the edge of his own bed 3 days after the break-in, staring at the unread texts on his phone. Kara hadn't responded since he questioned her. He kept rereading the last thing he sent. "It's incredibly convenient that only I was targeted for Charlotte." At the time, it had felt like logic. Now, it felt cruel, unnecessary. But it was already out there, sitting like poison in her inbox. He wanted to take it back. He also didn't. That was the worst part. The police hadn't made much progress. A detective called him for follow-up, asked more questions. Repeated ones. Was he sure he hadn't been followed? Had he told anyone he was staying at Kara's that night? Had he given anyone his phone password before? No. Then came the harder ones. Do you think Kara could have been involved? That one hit like a hammer. He paused. The detective noticed, I don't know. I don't think so. But he did think so. At least a little. And that little thought was growing fast. I tend to overthink everything and maybe back myself into a corner because of it. He started doing what overthinkers do. He investigated for it to be from his couch, on his phone. Her social media accounts weren't private. He scrolled through her Instagram first, mostly harmless photos, coffee, cats, sunsets, the occasional selfie. But in one comment thread from months back, he noticed a familiar name, a guy named Drew. She'd replied to him with a heart emoji. That was the first crack. He found Drew's profile. Public, messy. Tweets filled with quotes about heartbreak and good guys finishing last. He had a face that looked like it had been punched once and learned nothing from it. Smug, overconfident. Thin lips curled like he was judging everyone. And then he found the tweet, almost got sent to juvie over a window. Parents bailed me out. Lesson learned? Not really. That's when it all clicked. Kara had an ex-boyfriend. And he had a record for breaking and entering. His brain spun into overdrive. What if they hadn't really broken up? What if this was a setup from the start? What if Kara was luring men through Tinder and letting Drew handle the dirty work? It was insane. But it felt right. It made the fear manageable. If it was a setup, then he hadn't been powerless. He'd been tricked. And being tricked was easier to swallow than being helpless. He kept digging, found mutual follows between Kara and Drew on old platforms, Tumblr, even Pinterest. It looked like they'd unfollowed each other recently. But how recent? What if they staged it? What if Drew had been in her apartment before, knew the layout, knew which window was easy to break? His paranoia grew legs and teeth. I built up this whole narrative in my head. It didn't stop there. He remembered telling his friend Bill about Kara after their second date. Bill had asked to see a photo, had smirked when he saw it. What if Bill had known Drew? They were from the same town. They both played in that terrible punk band back in college. He checked Facebook. Sure enough, Bill and Drew were friends. It all lined up, or at least he made it line up. A week later, he went to the police station and asked to update his statement. See, I think she was involved, he said quietly. The officer didn't blink, just nodded and wrote it down. He walked out of the station not feeling safer, not relieved, just cold. Kara hadn't messaged him since. He didn't message her again. He began telling the story to others. First to a co-worker over lunch. Man, you won't believe what happened to me. Got catfished by this girl, Kara. Whole robbery was a setup. Then to his cousin. Then to his roommate. Eventually, to strangers at bars. It became a party trick. People leaned in, fascinated, shocked, outraged. Everyone loved a Tinder horror story. He played the part of the wounded hero, smirked in the right places, shrugged at the end. What can you do? But at night, he stared at the ceiling and wondered, what if he'd gotten it all wrong? What if she hadn't been involved? The hardest part of paranoia isn't believing your theory. It's what happens if you're wrong. Months passed. Summer melted into foliage. He stopped checking her social media daily, but not entirely. Some nights, when the city was too quiet and the shadows too honest, he'd scroll her old posts again, like digging into a wound just to make sure it still hurt. He'd blocked her. She hadn't tried to reach out anyway. The silence between them had solidified into something permanent, concrete, unspoken. Still, the robbery lingered. He replaced the phone, changed his passwords, canceled every account and credit card, even closed his savings account, just in case they had accessed it before Apple killed the signal. He bought a bat and kept it beside his bed. Trust had become a luxury. One evening in early October, he told the story again, this time at a friend's birthday party. A new group, unfamiliar faces. When someone mentioned Tinder, he took a slow sip of beer and said, "Let me tell you how I got played." He told it all. The masked men, the lack of damage to her stuff, the weird calm she'd shown, her shady ex-boyfriend, the fake breakup theory, the police report, the silence after. Someone said, "Dude, that's wild." Someone else laughed and added, "She really set you up?" He nodded. but something inside him tensed. He didn't feel proud of Sahubed. He felt tired. Still, he said nothing. He let the myth of the setup live, because the truth, whatever it was murkier, messier, harder to hold. Weeks later, he opened the news app out of habit. A headline grabbed his gut and twisted. Yes, woman hospitalized after violent home invasion. He clicked before his brain could fully process. The photo loaded slowly, but he recognized her instantly. Osahits. Kara, bruised, pale, hooked to machines. The article was short and brutal. A man had broken into her apartment, assaulted her. She had suffered serious injuries, hospitalized in critical condition. A suspect had been caught on the scene. Name, Drew Kessler. His blood turned to stone. It was Kara, and the culprit was nice guy. He stared at the screen for a long time, reading the paragraph over and over. The pieces fell into place, but not the way he'd arranged them. It hadn't been a con, it had been a warning. The first break-in, the one he experienced, was Drew's twisted attempt to scare her, to punish her, to send a message. He simply wanted to scare her out of dating anyone else. And when that didn't work, when Kara refused to crawl back to him, he returned. And this time, he didn't bring a knife for show. He brought it to hurt. He felt sick. He said every cruel word he'd typed, every story he'd told, every time he'd imagined her smirking behind the robbery, it all came rushing back like cold water. He had taken his fear and turned it into a story where he was the hero and she was the villain. But she wasn't. She had been scared too, maybe even more than him, and he hadn't protected her. He had abandoned her. He didn't go to the hospital. He didn't try to send flowers. He didn't message her or unblock her number. What could he say? I'm sorry I accused you while you were surviving something unspeakable? No, that apology would be more for him than her. He didn't deserve that kind of closure. Some things you don't fix, you just carry them. I won't be asking Kara for forgiveness. That woman's heard enough from me for a lifetime. There are apologies so large, so overdue, they collapse under their own weight. After the article, he stopped telling the story, not just to strangers or friends, but even in his own head. The rehearsed details, the clever lines, the dramatic pause before the twist, all of it felt rotten now. Basha. He muted every keyword related to her online, blocked Drew's name too. But somehow, the news still bled through. She survived, but not untouched. One report said she had permanent nerve damage in her arm. Another hinted at vision loss in one eye. None of them confirmed anything in detail, but the absence of updates said enough. She had suffered. He sat alone on his apartment floor the night after reading those stories, the lights off, phone in hand, and whispered, I'm sorry. It echoed off empty walls. No one heard it but him. He considered writing her a letter. Not to send, he knew better than that, but to at least say the things clawing inside him. He pulled out a notebook, the one he usually used for work notes, and started. Dear Kara, you don't owe me anything, but I owe you everything. An apology, a truth I refused to see, a kindness I didn't offer, when you needed it. He stopped. What good would it do? Words couldn't untie the ropes, couldn't unshatter the window, couldn't unbreak her bones. He tore out the page. He started remembering the small details differently now. Her hands shaking when she untied him, the blank look in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the door, not at the thieves. He used to think that was guilt. Now he realized it was fear that did. I blamed an innocent girl for the actions of her awful ex, and worse, he hadn't just blamed her. He'd told everyone else to blame her, too. His story, his neat, rehearsed betrayal tale, had turned her into a villain she never asked to be. While she was trying to survive, he was turning her pain into punchlines, and no one stopped him. Because he made it entertaining. He tried deleting the texts. He really did. But something in him couldn't let go of them completely. The screenshots, the old photos, her voice notes from before everything broke, her laugh, her stories about growing up in Ohio, the dog she used to have, the way she said syrup, like syrup. They weren't just memories. They were evidence of who she really was, and not the character he wrote her into, but the woman she had actually been. Kind, curious, maybe a little guarded, but brave, braver than him. Brave enough to date again after Drew, brave enough to open her home, brave enough to get up and untie him while she was still shaking herself. And he, the one who had every reason to trust her, didn't. He never dated again in the same way. Sure, he went out, met people, had a few relationships, but the part of him that used to hope, that used to believe in someone quickly and fully, was quieter now. Suspicion didn't leave. It settled in, made a home in the corners of his mind. Even when someone laughed the right way or touched his shoulder with genuine affection, there was always a whisper, what if? And he hated it, not because it made dating harder, but because it reminded him of what he did to Kara. He never looked her up again. Not directly, but sometimes when someone mentioned a woman named Kara at work or in passing, his breath would catch, just in case. He thought about donating to a domestic violence charity. He did, once, anonymously. It didn't make him feel better. It wasn't supposed to. He didn't want to be forgiven. He just wanted not to forget. The worst ghosts aren't the ones that haunt your house. They're the ones you built yourself. Years passed. He moved to a new apartment, a new job, even a new city. And yet, the memory followed him like a shadow, never speaking, never screaming, but always present. Sometimes it showed up as a dream, a door slamming in the middle of the night, a window breaking, rope cutting into his wrists. But mostly, it was quieter than that. A flicker of memory when he passed a bookstore, the scent of Thai food, a scent from that forgotten movie playing softly in a cafe. It never really went away. He didn't expect it to. One rainy afternoon, he stopped at a corner coffee shop to wait out the storm. The kind of place with cracked tiles and too many flyers on the wall. As he stirred sugar into his cup, a couple sat at the table across from him. They were laughing. That easy. Early days kind of laugh. He saw the way the woman leaned forward, how her hand rested on the man's wrist. The exact way Kara used to touch him on their first date. He felt something twist in his chest. Regret, memory, envy. He looked away. That kind of warmth felt unreachable now, not because no one else was capable of offering it, but because he wasn't sure he'd ever accept it again. He sometimes wondered what might have happened if he'd trusted her. If, instead of blaming her, he'd held her afterward, asked her how she felt, what she needed. If he had believed her, even for one more day, would she have let him in? Would they have gone to the police together, sat through the investigation as a team? Would she have told him more about Drew, given the cops more reason to track him down before he came back? Would she have been safer? The question crushed him because it was too late now. I left her to deal with him. He no longer told the story at bars. When Tinder came up in conversation, he simply smiled and said, "I don't use it anymore." No punchlines, no pity, just distance. Because he didn't deserve to own the story anymore. Not like that. It belonged to her now. She was the one who survived it. Some nights he wrote journal entries, not addressed to her, not even named. Just lines like, "I should have stayed. I should have seen the fear in her eyes for what it was. I should have never told that story like I was the victim." Then he closed the notebook and shoved it into a drawer. Some sins don't need witnesses. He thought about forgiveness, not hers, his own, and how impossible it felt. I've spent the last few years trying to forgive myself for this, but it didn't come easy. Self-forgiveness wasn't a light switch. It wasn't something you earned after a good deed or a single revelation. It was slow, heavy, one small inch at a time, like climbing out of a well with slippery walls. Some days he slid backward. Other days he stood at the top and still refused to step out because the guilt felt safer than letting go. In his latest apartment, the window locks were double reinforced. He still checked them 3 times a night, just in case. The bat stayed beside the bed. The fear faded with time, but the lesson didn't. I swear, never again would he confuse a gut feeling with the truth. Never again would he let suspicion speak louder than compassion. Why, if he ever found love again, truly, deeply, he promised himself one thing. He would listen better, not just to words, but to silences, or to trembles in the voice, to what wasn't being said. Because sometimes survival doesn't look like screaming, or sometimes it looks like a girl sitting quietly on a couch, too afraid to move, while the man she trusted slowly begins to betray her with his eyes. She thought locking her bedroom door would be enough. It wasn't. Among the plushies on her shelf, a teddy bear she didn't recognize stared back. The robbery had been a distraction. The real nightmare came later. It wasn't what they stole. It was what they left behind. Somewhere, maybe just a wall away, someone was watching, and he saw everything. We came back from spring break, buzzing, but exhausted. I remember just staring in dismay at the door, standing there, ajar. It didn't feel real at first. Her roommates stood behind her, equally stunned, holding their bags like tourists who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in someone else's tragedy. Inside was chaos. The TV was still there, but the couch had been torn apart. Empty boxes were scattered across the floor. Someone had gone through the kitchen drawers and dumped cereal across the counter. A bottle of wine had been smashed. Even the fridge door hung slightly open. The police were called, of course, belatedly. None of them were thinking straight. And when they did think, it was only about the obvious. What was missing? A MacBook Air, our PlayStation, and a bunch of cash that one of my roommates kept hidden under their mattress. That was the immediate list. But as they cleaned and recounted, the list grew. Small things disappeared in silence. Among the casualties was a crock-pot, then a book on photography. Disturbingly, a framed photo of the three of us from spring break the year before this. That one stung most. She didn't even like the photo. They were wearing bikinis and drinking. It felt intimate in the way only hindsight makes clear. And now, someone had taken it. Not the frame, not for decoration, for something else. They joked nervously about perverts and freaks, but the laughter didn't last. I kissed. Something shifted after that. Every day brought a new discovery. Her roommate noticed jewelry was missing. Another swore she'd lost some underwear, but brushed it off as hotel forgetfulness. But she couldn't brush it off anymore. The picture haunted her. That image didn't belong in the hands of a stranger. I started pushing my roommates to keep checking if anything else was missing. She became obsessed with the idea that they'd been targeted, that it hadn't been random. The police, polite but tired, reminded them about the string of burglaries in the area. Just bad luck, they said. Coincidence? Probably teenagers. Nothing more. But she couldn't sleep. And then she found the pen. It was sitting on her bedside table. Not where she kept her pens. Not the kind she used. It was cheap, shiny, too new. She picked it up, clicked it. Tried to write. Nothing. It didn't work. Strange. I just shrugged and then threw it in the trash. Then came the bear. It was nestled between her other plush toys. A beige, silky-furred teddy with shiny eyes and a stitched red heart. She didn't recognize it. That fact alone might have been forgivable. She had lots of plushies. People gave them to her over the years. But this one didn't belong. Its eyes looked wrong. Not cute. Cold. She picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. And when she squeezed it, she felt something hard inside. With shaking fingers, she opened the seam at the back. Nestled inside was a small black square, a lens, a camera. She didn't scream, not right away. Instead, her body shut down. Numbness. Her thoughts flickered through every vulnerable moment she'd had in that room. Dressing, undressing, crying, sleeping, all of it. Possibly watched. She didn't wait for morning. She woke her roommates, shaking and stuttering, holding the bear like evidence in a murder trial. Together, they searched her room, using flashlights and phone lights, crawling on hands and knees, or they found more. In total, I found the teddy, the pen, a smiley face badge, a plush snail, and then finally hidden in my bathroom, a second spy cam pen. That was the worst part. How easy it had been. How normal those objects looked. How invisible the invasion had become. The police came again. This time, they took things seriously. They bagged the devices, promised to try tracing the signal, but then came the bad news. The cameras were broadcasting wirelessly, which meant that there was no actual way to tell what was receiving that signal. The tech was too basic. They said these weren't Pentagon-level bugs, just cheap gadgets bought online, and the range, no more than 150 feet. Whoever watched had been close, next door, across the street, maybe even in the car that always parked just a little too close. She moved out within days. Couldn't breathe in that room anymore. Her roommates, too. They crashed on friends' couches, stayed in dorms they'd long since outgrown. They kept returning to the house, combing every room, every corner, looking for more. But the cameras were gone, or had never been in the other rooms. She didn't know what scared her more, that she was the only one targeted, or that the others had just not found theirs yet. She couldn't sleep without imagining red blinking lights hidden in bookshelves, without scanning hotel mirrors for reflections, without checking under beds, inside vents, behind paintings. Even when nothing turned up, her mind did. Every silence was suspicious, every object suspect. Therapy helped a little. But paranoia has long fingers, and it grabs hardest in the quietest moments. There was one thing that never left her mind. The absolute scariest thing to me is knowing that the spy cams left in her house were fairly basic, cheap ones that you can find in Walmart or on Amazon. They didn't have much range. They weren't fancy, no infrared, no motion tracking, just basic Wi-Fi enabled streaming cameras. The kind anyone could buy, the kind anyone could hide. That meant he was close. She remembered the landlord's brother stopping by unannounced, the repair guy who lingered too long in the hallway, the neighbor who never smiled but always stared, even the Uber driver who once insisted on walking her to the door. All possible, all maybe, all unknowable. Police had no leads. The signal couldn't be traced. The devices were too generic, unregistered. There were no fingerprints, no useful DNA. In the end, all they had was fear. The only thing worse than being watched is never knowing if it's over. Cameras can be found. But what about the things they saw? What about the footage? Where did it go? Did someone record it? Was it still out there? She kept dreaming of footsteps, not the loud kind that slam into memory, but soft ones, bare feet on carpet, rubber soles on tile, quiet, creeping, deliberate. In her dreams, they always stopped at her door. She'd lie there, paralyzed in the dark, watching the handle turn, but the door never opened. That's what made it worse. It wasn't just the idea that someone had filmed her. It was the idea that someone had stood in her room, touched her things, sat on her bed. She thought about the pen again, how it hadn't worked, how it had been placed there on purpose, like a joke, a game. And what about the bear? Had he arranged it among the others to blend in? Had he touched her favorite plushies to do it? Had he laughed to himself while doing it? She tried to retrace every step. Who had been in the house before they left? Had someone snuck in and waited? Or had they entered after the break-in, a second visit, separate from the theft? Some nights, she swore she remembered hearing a noise, a creak, a click, a draft. She tried, eventually, to move on. New apartment, new locks, nothing that connected to that house. No shared furniture, no trinkets. But even now, when she hears something fall in the middle of the night, her breath catches. She gets out of bed, not to check, but to make sure the bear is still gone. Weeks had passed since she left the house, but the fear hadn't faded. If anything, it had hardened into something worse, certainty. Certainty that it hadn't ended. She bought a police scanner, learned the radio codes, listened to chatter late into the night. Every break-in report made her jump. Every possible tenant, burglary in progress, made her throat tighten. The cops had stopped calling. They'd been polite, but distant. To them, it was over. Just another case in a college neighborhood. But something changed the day she visited an electronics store to replace her headphones. But she passed a display of cheap gadgets, webcams, USB drives, and spy gear. At the corner of the display was a stuffed bear. Not the exact same one, but eerily similar. Same stitched heart, same glossy eyes. She picked it up, heart racing, turned it over. This one had a sticker on the back. Model QX Spy Bear. Supports local and Wi-Fi streaming. 50-foot range. The sales rep wandered over. She asked casually if many people bought these. He laughed. We actually sold a ton of those to a guy like maybe 2 months ago. Real quiet dude. Came back 3 times, always wore the same hoodie. Her mouth went dry. Do you have a security footage? She asked. Oh, the guy shrugged. That's corporate level. But you can ask the manager. She did, and the manager wasn't thrilled. But when she explained everything and showed the police report number, he agreed to check. What they found wasn't perfect, no face, no name, but it was something. A man, average height, wearing a black hoodie and gloves, buying 5 of the same bear, no card, no loyalty account, cash only. Still, it was proof that someone had planned this, that it wasn't a random burglary, that he knew. Later that night, her paranoia turned obsessive. She dug the spy cam pin out of storage and powered it on with a USB adapter. The camera light blinked for a second, then off. She opened her laptop. No software, no tools, but the pin still emitted something, a signal. She ran a Wi-Fi scan. There it was, SSID, PlushyCam 05. No connection possible. Just the broadcast name. But it was still transmitting, still searching. She scanned again, and another SSID blinked into view. PlushyCam 03, but this one had 1 bar of signal. She froze. It meant something nearby, maybe a block away. Still had one of the devices active. The 1 bar signal taunted her like a whisper through walls. It blinked on her screen, faint but real. She wasn't imagining it. One of the spy cams was still active, near her new apartment. Her heart pounded. She closed the laptop and stood up, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. Every shadow, every corner of the room felt like it held a hidden eye. She pulled the curtains, then slid her laptop into a tote bag and threw on a hoodie. If that camera was active, it had to be nearby, and she was going to find it. She walked out into the night. It had rained earlier. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine needles. She walked slowly, scanning her Wi-Fi app every few steps. Most SSIDs were what you'd expect. Netgear Dix, Sam's iPhone, dorm life. But then, Plushy Cam 03, 2 bars. She stopped as a modest 2-story building stood to her left. Windows dark. A dim porch light flickered. She stared at it, holding her breath. She walked past it slowly. The signal dropped. She turned back. The signal returned. This was it. The front entrance had an outdated keypad. No security camera. She didn't have a plan, just adrenaline. But a familiar name on the mailbox caught her eye. Gee, Spinks, the guy from the basement band next door to her old house. He used to practice guitar with the window wide open. Always stared a little too long when they walked by. She remembered him. He'd shown up once when they were moving out, uninvited. Claimed he was just grabbing a package. He'd even offered to help them carry things. Smiled a little too much. Asked too many questions. Too specific. She remembered brushing it off as awkwardness. But now she took a photo of the mailbox label. Back home, she looked up the building's layout. It was a rental, 4 units, 2 on each floor. She couldn't see which one was his, but she knew he lived on this street, and one of the cameras was still active inside. She went to the cops the next day. They were more interested this time. She had video footage from the electronics store. A pattern of purchase. A known model of spy cam. Now, a signal traceable to a known location. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was close. They filed for a warrant. 2 days later, they executed it. She wasn't allowed inside, but she waited in the patrol car, chewing her lip raw as the officers knocked. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Then came the officer who spoke to her originally, face pale. We found something. They hadn't just found 1 camera. They'd found 6. 2 plushies, a clock radio, a functioning outlet charger with a lens built in, and a baseball cap that held a microcam inside its bill. One of the plushies still had the barcode tag from the same store, but worse than the devices was the wall. An entire corner of the man's bedroom had been converted into a crude viewing station. Cables, monitors, even a logbook with timestamps and notes. Some of them chillingly specific. Red robe girl sleeps 250 black bra, 1204, saved clip. Moved pen cam closer to dresser. One of the timestamps matched a night she remembered crying on the phone. She had been in bed with the curtains open. The camera had captured all of it. The police bagged everything. But there was more. He wasn't home. He had vanished. She was advised to stay somewhere else for a while. Not because he was dangerous, they couldn't even charge him yet, but because he knew they were coming now. That night, she stayed at a friend's place, but she couldn't sleep. The worst thing wasn't knowing she had been watched. It was not knowing for how long. The log stretched back months, maybe more. She thought the break-in had been the start. But what if it wasn't? What if it had started before spring break? What if he'd already been in the house before they left? She went back and searched her old social media. Photos tagged at home. Instagram lives where her room was in the background, clips from the living room. One video made her stomach drop, a tour of their spring decorations. In it, the camera lingered too long on her closed bedroom door, and in the comments, an anonymous user. Cute house. She checked the profile. No followers, no posts. But the account had viewed all her stories for the past 6 months. She reported it, blocked it, but she knew that wasn't enough. So there was something empowering about shifting from victim to hunter. She'd spent months looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, terrified of what she couldn't see. But now, she knew. She knew who he was. She knew where he had lived. She knew what he wanted, and she was going to use all of it against him. The police were limited. No arrest had been made. Not yet. The footage they recovered wasn't legally sufficient to prove the cameras had been placed without consent. His absence meant no confession, no questioning. But she wasn't waiting. She reached out to an old friend, Maya, a computer science major with a taste for digital espionage. Maya didn't ask many questions, just listened, and then said, "Hey, if we can get him to interact even once, we can trace him." The bait had to be perfect, personal enough to catch his attention, public enough to be accessible, and just vulnerable enough to feel real. So she built the illusion. She reopened her old Instagram, one she had locked down. After the cameras were discovered, she made a post, a picture of her old bedroom, curtains drawn back, warm yellow light spilling out. Finally, back in the old house, new locks, new chapter. She tagged the location. She made it believable, with boxes in the corner, a coffee mug, and her favorite red robe hung on the door. The photo wasn't real. It was taken weeks ago. She wasn't even in the city. She was staying with Maya, 4 towns over, in an apartment layered with VPNs and fake Wi-Fi signals. Then she waited. The anonymous viewer account returned within 2 hours. It watched her story twice. The next morning, it watched again. Then, at 2:43 a.m., Maya's system pinged. Someone had connected to the fake Wi-Fi signal broadcasting from a decoy device planted near the house. The device mimicked a home network, same SSID as before, campus Wi-Fi private. The connection lasted 6 minutes, enough time to stand outside and scan. They had him. Maya began tracing. The device used a burner phone for hotspot tethering, but it made one mistake. It pinged off a known IP, a coffee shop 2 blocks away that required email login for Wi-Fi. Maya spoofed access logs, traced the MAC address, then ran it through a locally shared student tech database. His name wasn't G. Spinks after all. It was Malcolm Travers, an ex-grad student expelled 2 years ago after a series of complaints from female undergrads. None of it had gone public. He had vanished from the records. Now they knew where he was again. The police moved in. They found him living under a new name in a shared rental outside town. When they raided the place, they found hard drives, dozens of them, some encrypted, some not. Over 2 terabytes of voyeur footage, meticulously cataloged. But he hadn't just watched her. There were other women, other rooms, other plushies, pens, clocks, and even water bottles with micro lenses. The bear had been just one of many, but she was the first to fight back, the first to trap him. She sat in the court row 6 months later, hands trembling only slightly, as he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The footage had been enough. The digital footprint, the stalking charges, the illegal surveillance, the breach of privacy. His defense tried to argue mental instability. The judge wasn't moved. When the gavel fell, it was like a weight lifted off her chest. Justice, but not completely, because healing doesn't happen in a moment. It happens slowly, painfully, over time. Some nights, she still dreamed of red, blinking lights, of plushies with cold eyes, of bears that watched, but now she woke up knowing she'd fought back. And one epilogue, one last box. Months later, while organizing the last of her old belongings in storage, she opened a box marked Misk Bedroom. Inside was an old plush, a pink bunny she hadn't seen in years. She stared at it, heart thudding. It was soft, familiar. She squeezed it gently. Nothing inside. She turned it over. No stitching, no camera, just a note, folded neatly inside the box. I watched you grow brave. That's why I stopped. Her hands shook to it. The handwriting wasn't his. It was unfamiliar. No signature. Nothing else. She burned the note that night, just in case. When they first saw him, he looked almost peaceful. Barefoot, beer in a hand, eyes closed like he belonged there. Lisa didn't scream. She simply froze, stared, and whispered, Daddy, there's a man on our couch. The cabin was supposed to be empty. It was always empty this time of year, except now. Someone had made himself very, very comfortable. There were beer bottles everywhere, a man in boxers, and something about his smile made the father's blood run cold. By the time they learned the truth about Blake, they'd already shaken his hand. They left the city in search of silence, but the silence they found was the kind that listens back after a long drive filled with snacks, bickering kids, and stops to appease their 4-year-old's bladder. The family finally pulled into the clearing where the hunting cabin stood like a solemn sentinel under the shadow of the Tetons. It was an old cabin owned by Derek, a lifelong friend whose scattered, endearing mind had forgotten more plans than most people ever made. But Derek's word was gold, and he'd promised them the cabin would be theirs for the week. A quiet place for Thanksgiving, away from sirens and stress. The kids tumbled out before the engine stopped. Lisa, the eldest of 10, raced up the porch like she remembered it from another life. But when she threw open the door, she stopped, cold. Her eyes locked onto something inside, and within seconds, she was back in her father's arms, whispering, Daddy, someone's in there. He thought she was joking, maybe a bear, a raccoon, but when he stepped in, there was no mistaking the figure sprawled on the couch, a wiry man in his underwear, surrounded by empty beer bottles, staring at the ceiling fan like it held the answer to a question he'd long forgotten. The father's anger was instant, instinctual, but the man held up his hands and introduced himself with a grin. Blake, he said, as if that explained anything. He claimed he was a friend of Derek's from high school. I said Derek had offered him the place to recover from a messy divorce. Everything about him seemed disheveled but not dangerous, even charming in a pathetic kind of way. The dad wanted to be angry, but the story felt too specific to be fake, and the man's laugh. That made it seem like a misunderstanding. Still, space was tight. With 3 kids, including James, their 8-year-old son who struggled with change and unfamiliar faces, it just wasn't feasible to share. Blake, ever polite, said he'd pack up and leave in a couple of hours. The father agreed. They'd go to town, grab some supplies, and come back once Blake had cleared out. The drive to the village was quiet, uneasy. The mom offered up theories about Blake being harmless, just a sad man with nowhere to go. But their daughter remained pale and distant, staring out the window. At the general store, the father made the call to Derek. He expected a laugh, maybe a curse, and some casual explanation. Instead, Derek's voice dropped. Blake, that prick, the guy who used to bully me, he got busted cooking meth in a trailer park. The laughter died in the father's throat. Derek's panic escalated. He shouldn't be near people, near kids. I never told him anything about the cabin. I haven't talked to him in years. You need to go back with the cops. Now, something icy wormed through the father's spine. They left the kids and their mother in the town motel. Derek had already called his friend in the sheriff's department. By the time the dad met the deputies, he was shaken with anger. The cabin door was wide open when they arrived. Inside was a war zone. Glass crunched under boots. The television lay in shards. Swear words were spray-painted across the master bedroom walls. The couch, where Blake had sat drinking hours before, was slashed with something sharp. The deputies exchanged a look. He didn't just crash here, one of them said. This was planned, dumb. But Blake was nowhere to be seen. Until the coughing started, the noise came from above. There was an attic crawl space. The dad showed them where the hatch was. One officer pulled it down. A ladder unfolded, and a cloud of dust spilled out. Then a face, covered in grime, blinking, rasping. Blake, too weak to fight, too high to run. The thin air had aggravated his asthma. They cuffed him and dragged him down, mumbling something about Thanksgiving being ruined again. The story should have ended there. But when the deputies searched the guest room, they found more. A coil of rope, a roll of duct tape, a hatchet, and a loaded handgun. He had a license for the gun, sure. But that didn't answer the real question. What had he planned to do before they showed up early? No one ever got that answer. And no one wanted to know. They stayed in town that week. Derek came down, bringing his stepdaughter, who made the little one laugh again. Thanksgiving was quiet but safe. The cabin, for now, stayed empty. And Blake, well, no one ever saw him again. It was 2 days later when the nightmares began. Lisa was the first. She jolted upright in the motel bed, screaming without sound, her face pale as linen. Her mother clutched her tightly, whispering reassurances, but Lisa only stared at the corner of the ceiling. She wouldn't say what she saw. James, usually quiet, started wetting the bed again. The stress was getting to him. And the youngest, little Nora, began calling her doll Blakey. No one had taught her that name. No one. The father couldn't sleep. He kept playing the encounter over and over. Blake's smile, the slow way he blinked, like he was pretending to be calm. Too calm. He thought about the rope, the duct tape, the hatchet, the gun, and how easily all of it could have been used. He'd brought his family straight into a trap. Derek insisted he stay in town a while longer, and they tried to make the best of it. Days were spent walking trails, buying pastries, and pretending life was normal. But something lingered, not just in their minds, but in the town. The local sheriff dropped by the motel and asked for another chat. Apparently, the more they dug into Blake's background, the worse it got. He'd been in psychiatric care a few years back, released early after a misfiled evaluation. There were hints he'd been stalking Derek online. Obsessive posts, even forged emails. Most disturbingly, his car hadn't been parked near the cabin. It had been found abandoned near a truck stop 80 miles away, which meant Blake had been in those woods for days, maybe longer, watching, waiting, and no one had noticed. The father's hands trembled when he signed the sheriff's paperwork. Then came the final discovery. Hidden behind a loose panel in the cabin's laundry room was a small, cloth-covered notebook. Inside, pages of messy, agitated writing, sketches of people, a floor plan of the cabin, and one word repeated over and over: erase. They left the motel a week later, but nothing felt resolved. So, back in the city, the noises returned, except now they were inside. The sound of floorboards creaking when no one was walking, whispers under running water, the baby monitor crackling with static, followed by a soft cough. Always the cough. Nora stopped sleeping altogether. She began hiding her doll in the freezer. When asked why, she simply said, "He doesn't like the cold." The father pored over everything he remembered: the way Blake smiled at his kids, the calmness in his voice, the damage to the cabin, the rope. He called Derek again, asked for more details. Derek confessed something new. Months before the Thanksgiving trip, he'd noticed a small envelope on his porch. No postage. Inside was a Polaroid, a photo of his stepdaughter taken from behind a fence at her school. He never told his wife. He thought it was a prank. Now, he wasn't so sure. That night, the family dog went missing. James swore he saw someone open the gate. Security cameras showed nothing, but the dog never came back. Days later, Lisa came home from school with a torn backpack and refused to say what happened. Only later did she mutter something about a man with a limp. The father bought a gun. He started sleeping in the hallway outside his kids' bedrooms, eyes open, ears tuned for creaks and breathing. Joy! On a particularly cold night, he received an email from an unknown sender. No subject. One attachment, a video. The footage was from inside the cabin, but not from their visit. It showed Blake. He was sitting on the couch, whispering to himself, staring directly into the camera. and in his lap, James' favorite toy truck. The timestamp read 2 days before the family arrived. And then Blake looked up and smiled. The father didn't tell anyone about the video, not at first, not even his wife. He copied it to a flash drive and kept it hidden in the drawer beneath his socks. Each night, when the rest of the family was asleep, he would watch it again, frame by frame, looking for some clue, some hint in Blake's face that might explain it all. But there was nothing. Just that same eerie stillness, that same slow grin, a man completely at peace with his own madness. The police were no help. He brought the flash drive in, finally, desperate for answers. But they only confirmed what he already knew. The footage was authentic. The timestamp real. Blake had been there, watching, waiting. And the video had been sent from an encrypted server overseas. Untraceable. They offered sympathy, suggested therapy. That was all. Meanwhile, things were unraveling. Lisa started sleepwalking. Her father found her standing outside on the front lawn one morning, barefoot, whispering, "Don't let him in." James stopped speaking altogether. Not a word for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he asked if they could burn the cabin down, and little Nora began drawing pictures. In every single one, there was a tall man standing in the window, always watching. Then came the knock, 3 in the morning, a slow, deliberate tap at the front door. The father rose from the hallway floor, gun already in hand. Through the peephole, nothing. No one on the porch, no footprints in the frost, just silence. But when he opened the door a crack, a folded piece of paper fell through. 6 words, scrawled in frantic handwriting, "You should have stayed away." They left that morning, packed the car in record time, and drove with no real destination, just away, as far away as possible. For a while, they stayed in cheap motels, sleeping in shifts, living off way station food. Then they found a small apartment in another state. Derek helped cover the deposit, a fresh start, he called it. But it wasn't. The baby monitor still crackled. The drawings continued. That's what. And the father, he had started coughing. The same hollow, rasping cough he remembered from that attic. A girl opens her front door expecting a package. Instead, a half-drugged classmate charges in with a selfie stick, high and screaming nonsense. He crashes into antiques, tosses heirlooms, and smashes light fixtures, all while believing he's live streaming his insanity. She's shoved against the wall. Her best friend disappears. The house becomes a war zone. He grabs the urn of her grandfather's ashes and laughs like a demon. That moment, something shifts. Shame flickers in his eyes. The stream wasn't real. The rage wasn't worth it. There are nights when the wind carries more than just air. It brings warnings. Oh, demoise. For her, that evening had felt off since midday. The sky was too still. The streets around her college were quieter than usual, as though something was hiding behind every corner, waiting. But she ignored it, because that's what people do when they want normal days to stay normal. She and Annalise, her closest friend since year 8, had decided to go straight to her place after class. Her father and stepmom were out with her toddler brother, giving her the house for the night. Homework was the plan. Hot chocolate, media studies, maybe a film if they finished early. But fate had other ideas. The doorbell rang at 6:08 p.m. She opened the door casually, expecting a delivery. Instead, standing on the porch in worn-out joggers, face pink from excitement or substances, was the Jizzler. That wasn't his real name, of course. He'd christened himself that. A self-declared streamer with 10 followers and more ambition than brain cells. Real name? Unimportant. His legacy was carved in poor taste and worse decisions. She blinked in disbelief. What the hell? Before she could finish, he lunged forward with a grin that was all gums and chaos. Yo, surprise guest on the stream, baby, he bellowed. He held a phone attached to a selfie stick, the screen black and clearly powered off. She stumbled back instinctively, and he barged past her like he belonged there. He shoved his way into my house, leaving his mate on the doorstep. Alarmed, I quickly slammed the door, locking the mate out. His mate, a thin boy with a rat-like face, pounded the door once and then vanished, laughing. Jizzler wobbled down the hallway like a malfunctioning marionette, narrating nonsense into his dead phone. He took a deep inhale from a balloon and threw it behind him. "Whip it!" he shouted. "Got to be in the mood. Babe!" His movements were jerky, loose, yet dangerous. He was barely standing straight, yet every step brought him closer to disaster. Whatever he was on or had been drinking, it had scrambled his brain. He tripped over a hallway rug and knocked a decorative bowl to the floor. It shattered. She winced. That bowl had been a wedding gift to her father. She rushed forward, panic in her throat. "Get out," she snapped. "You can't just break into someone's house. This is a crime." He turned to her with glassy eyes and grinned like a toddler covered in paint. "Crime's just content. Girlie, don't take life so serious." Touch proposed. He reached for a framed family photo on the wall. She lunged and slapped his hand away. He shoved her. He shoved me hard against the wall, sending family photos crashing to the ground. She fell sideways, hitting her shoulder against the corner of a cabinet. Pain shot up her spine. "You're insane!" she screamed. From the kitchen, Annalise's voice echoed. "What's happening?" "Stay back," she shouted. But Annalise didn't stay back. Annalise entered the room cautiously, her arms drawn in tight against her sides. Her eyes flicked from the shattered hallway to the figure now stomping around like some deranged circus clown. "Is that Jizzler?" she whispered, stunned. "Yeah," the girl hissed. "He's high as hell and thinks he's famous." Jizzler whirled on them both. "Ladies, the people demand drama. Don't be shy now, we're live, baby." But the phone wasn't recording. The screen was blank. He stumbled into the living room, kicking a pair of slippers like footballs. Her pulse pounded. This was no longer funny or confusing. It was a full-on emergency. She ran after him. "Stop touching things. You need to leave before the police." But he wasn't listening. He was narrating. Jizzler was picking up my parents' things. His phone held up all the while. He found the glass cabinet near the fireplace. Her late grandmother's collection of porcelain swans, crystal dogs, and tiny ceramic clowns gleamed under the light. "No," she said, breath catching. "Don't." Gisela turned so the camera was filming him and reached behind him, sweeping ornaments off the shelf. Yes, they crashed to the ground, shattering, and I began to scream, and so did Annalise. The room echoed with the sound of loss. Each piece that broke wasn't just glass. It was memory, legacy. And he laughed. God, how he laughed. "Did you see that?" he shrieked at no one. "Did you get that chat smash points?" She lunged, grabbing his arm and digging her nails in. "Get out of my house," she howled. But the grip she had was weak, and he was slippery, slick with sweat and twitching. Instead, he shoved me again even harder, and I fell back and jarred my back against the fireplace. Her scream wasn't rage this time. It was pain. Bone met metal, nerve met flame. She crumpled to the floor. He laughed again, spinning with open arms like a mockery of joy. "House makeover," she sobbed, curled on the carpet as Annalise vanished again, this time completely. Her heart broke. She left me, alone with a lunatic, the Gisela, now in full mania, yanked cushions off the sofa, threw them around like confetti. One hit the television, knocking it over. One hard throw of a cushion caused the TV to topple to the ground and actually sparked. The stench of melting plastic filled the room. He turned his phone, still off, toward the sparks, like it was special effects. "Budget Michael Bay," he screamed. Then he looked up at the light fixture. Her lips parted. "No, don't you?" But of course, he did. Next, he was using his phone and the selfie stick to smash the light fixtures above his head. Glass rained down like toxic snowflakes. She shielded her head. Her back still screamed in pain. Her ears rang. Then, like a ghost, Annalise reappeared, this time holding something in each hand. In the right, a kitchen knife. In the left, a phone with the screen glowing. She yelled at the Gisela to stop. He did pause, looking at her holding the knife, and then began to let out the most insane hooting laugh. "Little Annie brought props," he mocked. "We doing improv now?" But she didn't flinch. Cool. Annalise told him that the cops were on their way and that he'd better stop. That sentence made something inside him twitch. He turned his phone around, realized it wasn't recording. "No signal," he mumbled. "No live." He blinked, looked around. Broken ornaments, cushions everywhere. Smoke, a girl crying, a friend with a knife. And the camera, useless. Then he saw it, the urn. It sat on the mantelpiece, centered like a shrine. Dull brains, engraved with a single name and 2 dates. Her grandfather's ashes. She saw it, too. Her breath caught in her throat. "Osras, please," she begged. "Don't touch that." He tilted his head. "What's this then? A trophy?" He reached for it, smirking. And for the first time, something inside her snapped past fear. I jumped to my feet and shouted the only thing I could think of. "Because that's my bloody granddad." The room froze. Even Annalise stopped breathing. "Marshus, Jizzler stared at her. It was like time hiccuped. Does. He blinked once, twice. His smirk faded. His arm dropped an inch. It felt like I'd slapped him or thrown cold water in his face. He turned slowly and looked around the chaos he'd caused. The broken glass, the shattered swans, the crying girl, the friend with the knife, and the urn. He very gently, almost comically, put Granddad's urn back on the mantelpiece. Then he collapsed onto the couch, sat down like a child caught stealing, silent. A few minutes later, red and blue lights painted the windows, and it was over. The sirens grew louder, a Doppler wail that cut through the walls like a razor. Blue and red lights flickered through the broken blinds, casting long, twitching shadows across the floor. He didn't move. Not when the car doors slammed. Not when footsteps crunched against the gravel outside. Not even when someone banged on the front door. 3 times in a pattern that was unmistakably police. She stood, hands trembling. Her back throbbed with a dull electric ache, and her knees threatened to give way under her. Annalise lowered the knife. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, but her grip was steady. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. She nodded without conviction. He nearly dropped Granddad. The front door burst open. 2 officers entered, 1 male, 1 female, their gazes sweeping the scene instantly. It took them exactly 3 seconds to assess. The girl on the left gasped. "Jesus Christ!" "Hands where we can see them," barked the male officer. But there was no struggle. The Jizzler just sat there, blinking. He looked up at them like a confused child, then down at the shattered ornaments surrounding his shoes. His lips moved, but nothing came out. On the ground. Now, he complied, slowly, deliberately, like he was in a fog. When they handcuffed him, he didn't resist. She didn't realize she was crying until Annalise wrapped an arm around her. The adrenaline was leaking out of her body now, leaving her hollow. Yes. An officer stayed behind to take statements while the others escorted him out. The girl watched as he was guided into the back of the cruiser. His head bowed. The balloon still lay on the floor near the front door, deflated and obscene. They gave their statements twice, then a 3rd time, then answered questions, then repeated themselves again for the written report. Hours passed. By the time her dad and stepmom came home, the cops were just finishing up. Her baby brother slept through it all, carried gently to bed without ever waking. Her father was furious at the situation, at the school, at the boy, but mostly at himself. "I should have been here," he kept repeating. "This shouldn't have happened." No one slept much that night. 3 days later, they found out he had been high on more than nitrous oxide. Someone had sold him a mix of MDMA and a research chemical so new that it hadn't been banned yet. Combined with the whippets and alcohol, it had scrambled him. Temporarily, but fully. The diagnosis: drug-induced psychotic episode. He had no memory of most of what happened. But the camera footage wasn't much help. Because, of course, it wasn't even recording. He'd never pressed the button. His family reached out, at first through the police, then through a solicitor, then finally in person. It was his older sister who came to their door with a handwritten letter and a trembling voice. "He's not well," she said. "He's not a bad person. Just really stupid, and trying too hard to be something he's not. Her stepmom sat down with her. Her dad did not. The girl didn't speak. She just stared at the letter in her hands. It was an apology of sorts, rambling, incomplete, but the shame came through and the fear. "I'm so sorry for what I did to your family. I didn't even realize I wasn't recording. I thought I was online. I thought it was a prank. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be seen." She folded the paper once, then again, then set it down. "I don't forgive him," she said. Her voice was calm, steady. "But I don't want him dead either. I just want him gone." The Monday after the incident felt like walking through an aquarium. Everything blurry, distorted, voices coming through as if underwater. She stepped through the college gates, shoulders tight, heart armored. Her bruises were hidden under layers of thick clothing, but the shame was harder to conceal. People stared, not everyone, but enough. Some eyes followed her like she was a crime scene photo come to life. Some eyes looked away too quickly, afraid of being implicated just by making contact. Annalise walked beside her in quiet solidarity. Neither of them had spoken much about that night, but they didn't need to. Sometimes silence was the only language that worked after something unspeakable. At the library, two girls whispered behind binders. One of them giggled, then shushed herself. The sound made her stomach turn. She reached her locker. There, tucked into the handle, was a note folded 4 times. She unfolded it slowly. "Oops, glad you're okay." He was always a knob. "If you want to talk, I'm around. Layla, from 3D Design." She stared at it. Layla, a girl she barely knew, friendly but distant. And somehow, this awkward scribble in pink ink meant more than anything the school had said, because the school hadn't said much. The headmaster had sent an email to her dad. It included words like disturbing and deeply regret and corrective disciplinary action. But it was clear the school was scrambling, not just for justice, but to cover themselves. Because the Jizzler, real name Bradley, was a student, and the school hadn't seen the signs, or they had and chose to ignore them. It didn't matter now. Bradley was suspended indefinitely. He wouldn't be returning for the rest of the term, or probably ever. The principal offered support resources and a safe space to process. But what she really needed was someone to explain how a walking TikTok joke became a threat in her living room. No one had answers for that. 3 nights later, the knock came. Not from police, from a lawyer. He arrived at 7:10 p.m. with a briefcase and a voice like lukewarm porridge. He introduced himself as Mr. Cates, solicitor for the Bronze family. He was polite, efficient, and disturbingly soft-spoken. "I come with an offer," he said. She, her father, and her stepmother sat in the living room, the same room that still bore the scars of that night. The new light fixture above them cast flickering shadows like ghosts against the walls. "Mr. Cates continued, Bradley's family is willing to cover all damages. Repairs, replacement of sentimental items where possible, compensation for emotional trauma, all contingent upon one condition. She knew before he said it. No charges. He paused. No further criminal action. No public statement. A complete closure of the matter. From your side. Her father stiffened. Her stepmother frowned. You're trying to buy silence. Mr. Kate smiled faintly. We're trying to prevent further harm. To who? She asked. He didn't answer. After he left, the silence in the room was heavy. Her father protested. They want us to just forget. After what he did, after what she went through, her stepmother looked exhausted. Maybe it's better this way. The trial would take months. The attention, her dad cut in. I don't give a damn about attention. She stood and went to the window. Outside, the street was still. Rain tapped the glass gently, like fingers trying to wake her from a dream. Let me think, she said. That night, she pulled out the letter again. The one his sister brought. His apology. She read it under a desk lamp. Each line was messy, scribbled, overwritten. He had drawn a broken heart at the bottom. It was stupid and childish, and yet one sentence stuck with her. I just wanted to be seen. The next morning, she made her choice. At first, she thought it was just dreams. They started a week after she turned down the lawyer's offer. Short, fractured things. Images more than sequences. A vase falling endlessly in slow motion. Her grandfather's urn rattling without wind. The sound of cushions ripping, echoing as if from underwater. She would wake at 3 o'clock, lungs tight, sheet soaked, ears straining for a sound that never came. It wasn't sleep paralysis. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a presence, something watching from just outside the frame of her life. The first time it happened while she was awake. She was brushing her teeth, middle of the day. Bright sunshine outside. She saw a shape in the mirror. Not a person, not clearly. A movement, quick and smooth, like someone stepping into the hall behind her. She turned so fast, she knocked over the cup of toothbrushes. Nothing there. She laughed at herself. Then she noticed the bathroom door. It was swinging open and then slowly back. But no draft, no windows, no one else home. The next sign came from the urn. She kept it exactly where it had always been, on the mantelpiece, facing forward, undisturbed. But one morning, she came downstairs and found it turned just slightly. The nameplate wasn't facing forward anymore. It was angled toward the couch, where the Gisler had collapsed. She assumed it was her dad, put it back. The next day, it was angled again. The day after that, even more, like something was watching or warning. She brought it up to Annalise on a Sunday afternoon while they were in her room. The rain outside was heavy, gray sheets rolling over the windows like morning veils. Annalise paused mid-sip of her tea. Are you saying you think, Gza? I don't know what I'm saying, she said quickly. I just know something isn't right. Her friend frowned. Do you think you're just processing trauma? Like the urn? It could be your subconscious looking for control again. Maybe. But deep inside, she didn't believe that. Because what happened next couldn't be explained by trauma. It was the 4th night of bad sleep when she saw him, not her granddad, not Bradley. someone else. She woke up to the sound of whispering. Not voices exactly, just a feeling in the air, like thoughts trying to speak. The room was freezing, and there, at the edge of her bed, was a man, old, pale, wearing a suit far too outdated for this decade. But it was his face that made her scream, because he had no eyes, just sockets, empty, endless, and somehow, watching when she turned on the light, he vanished. Her father called a doctor. The doctor prescribed rest, counseling, maybe a sedative. Her stepmom said it was grief. Her brother said nothing. He was too young. But she knew. This wasn't grief. Sir, this wasn't madness. This was after something sacred was nearly broken, after a home was treated like a playground, after bloodlines were disturbed. She sat by the fireplace the next evening, watching the urn. "I'm sorry," she whispered to it. The urn vibrated, just once, then was still again. She stopped sleeping in her bedroom. Instead, she moved to the sofa in the living room. She kept a candle lit on the mantel. And one night, just after midnight, it blew out on its own. The house was never warm again. Not truly. Even when the thermostat glowed at 21 degrees, even when the radiators hissed and clicked and pulsed with the heat, there was still a chill. It clung to corners, lurking beneath rugs, behind curtain folds, in the spaces between silence. And the urn, always the urn, it now sat on the mantel like a sentinel. She never dared move it again, never dusted too closely. The one time she tried to polish the plaque, her fingers went numb for nearly 10 minutes. Annalise stopped visiting, not out of fear, she said, but because something about the living room makes me feel like I'm intruding. They tried lighting incense. They tried prayer. They even considered moving it to the attic. But every time the topic came up, a light would flicker. Once, a glass cracked in the cupboard. Eventually, her father just said, "Leave it alone." One night, sometime after 2 a.m., she woke on the living room sofa to the smell of burning. She bolted upright. The candle, her only light, was extinguished, its wax cold and untouched. But the scent remained. Burnt wood, smoldering paper. She checked the fireplace, the walls, the floors. No fire. Then she turned to the mantel and froze, because beside the urn, resting gently atop her grandmother's broken photo frame, was a handful of blackened ash. Not spilled from the urn, it sat neatly, deliberately, like a warning. That was the first night she heard the footsteps. Heavy, measured, slow. They started in the hallway, moved to the kitchen, then behind the sofa where she lay, too afraid to turn. She heard breathing, ragged, like someone dragging wet lungs through a cold throat. Then, nothing. Morning came with sunlight that felt fake, too bright, too cheerful. She checked the cameras. Her father had installed one in the living room just weeks ago. She pressed play. Nothing, no movement, except at exactly 3:01 a.m., the candle blew out by itself. The next day, she opened the urn. She didn't mean to. Something compelled her, a pull behind the ribs. Not curious, not disrespectful. Something between guilt and duty. She unscrewed the lid slowly, half expecting a scream to erupt from it. Instead, just ashes. Fine, soft, cold. She dipped 2 fingers in, closed her eyes, and had heard something not loud. Inside her mind, a voice, cracked like wind through dry leaves. He was uninvited. She gasped and dropped the urn. It didn't fall. It hovered just a moment, then slowly lowered back into place. She screamed anyway. Her father rushed in. She said nothing. He didn't ask, but he looked at the urn, then at her, and simply said, "I believe you." That night, the TV turned itself on, flickered static. Cluck. Then showed her front door. Then the hallway. Then her. From above, as if the ceiling had eyes, she unplugged the television. It stayed on for 6 more seconds. It wasn't until the 3rd visitation that she realized the ghost wasn't her grandfather. The smell was wrong. He used to wear cedar cologne. This smelled like rot. And the shadow, too tall. Too thin. Not familiar. This wasn't a soul. It was something clinging to what he had once protected. And it wanted more. She began to sleep in the hallway. Nowhere else felt safe. Sometimes she'd wake to the sound of whispers through the floorboards. Sometimes she'd find handprints on the walls, dusty but upward facing, as if someone had clawed from below. Once, she found the urn open. Inside a single fingernail, yellowed, cracked, human. She nearly threw up. Instead, she burned sage. The smell turned sour. She made a decision. She needed to speak to Bradley. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not her father. Not Annalise. She left a note on her pillow. "I need to close this. Don't follow me." The detention center was only an hour away. They let her in because he had placed her on the approved visitor list weeks ago. He'd been waiting. The glass between them felt thinner than she expected. He looked worse than she remembered. Eyes sunken, hair grown out and greasy, hoodie too big, like he was retreating into it. "Hey," he said. His voice was fragile, stripped of performance. She stared. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "Neither did I," she said. "So They sat for a moment in silence. Then she leaned forward. "Us, what do you remember from that night?" He looked at her, blinking hard. "I remember thinking I was live, that I was winning, that nothing mattered unless people saw it." "And when did it stop?" He hesitated. "When I picked up the urn," he shivered. "I don't know how to explain it, but the second I held it, it was like every nerve in my body froze. I could feel him." She didn't blink. "You knew it wasn't just ashes." He nodded. "What?" "I didn't see anyone, but something was in the room, and it hated me, not just for what I did, but what I brought in." He looked up, face pale. "I was never alone that night." He told her the truth. The pills he took, one of them wasn't just synthetic ecstasy. It was something called veil dust, a designer drug rumored to break barriers between dimensions. He laughed bitterly. "It was supposed to give me third eye perception. Instead, I broke a wall I wasn't supposed to. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed, and whatever you dragged in followed me. He nodded slowly. I think it latched onto you. That night, she returned home just after midnight. The house was quiet. Her father was asleep on the couch, TV humming with a muted cooking show. She stepped carefully toward the fireplace. The urn waited. As always, she looked at it for a long time, then did what she knew had to be done. She took it to the river, the same one where her grandfather used to fish every summer until his hands got too weak to hold the rod steady. She stood at the edge, the wind sharp against her skin, water dark and slow-moving. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for letting him inside, for letting him touch you." Then she poured. Ash flowed like gray silk into the water, dissolving, scattering, vanishing. But not all of it. At the bottom of the urn was something hard. She reached in, a tooth. Old, human, cracked, not her grandfather's. She threw it as far as she could, then watched the ripples fade. The house was different after that. Warmer. The hallway stopped creaking at night. The TV no longer flicked on. The mirror no longer shifted. Even the urn, now empty, felt... She buried it beneath the old oak in the garden. Her father helped. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Feels right." Weeks passed. Bradley was released under a rehabilitation clause. No charges pressed, no trial, just supervision. She didn't see him again. But sometimes, in the hallway at college, she thought she heard his name whispered, not by people, but by the silence itself. She ignored it. She moved on, until one day she received a package. No return address. Inside, a phone. Old, cracked, dead battery. She plugged it in. When it turned on, there was one file, a video. She hesitated, then played it. The screen flickered to life. But it was footage from his phone. The night it all happened. The hallway, her scream, the crash of ornaments, and then something impossible. As Bradley picked up the urn, the camera, still filming, shifted its focus. Behind him, a figure, tall, faceless, stretching from floor to ceiling, watching. It reached toward the urn and vanished the moment she screamed, "That's my bloody granddad." The video cut. The screen went black. She stared at the reflection of herself in the screen and whispered, "You saved me, didn't you?" Her grandfather didn't haunt her. He protected her from something much, much worse. And now that thing was gone. But sometimes when the wind was still and the moon hung low, she swore she heard faint echoes from the fireplace. Not angry, not dark, just a quiet, gravelly voice that said, "Don't let them in again." It wasn't the sound of breaking glass that woke me. It was the sudden lurch, the feeling of motion while I was supposed to be dead asleep in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. My home, my car, was moving without me ever turning the key. Imagine waking up, entombed in sleeping bags, only to realize that strangers are driving you off into the dark countryside, and they don't even know you're in the car. That was the exact nightmare I woke into. People talk about home invasions as if homes are four-walled houses, But what happens when your home has 4 wheels and someone decides to steal it with you still inside? I should have leapt out when I had the chance. But adrenaline plays cruel tricks, paralyzing when it should mobilize. And by the time I worked up the courage, the field was already burning. Some friendships are born in bars, others through school, mine in a blaze of gasoline and guilt, when 2 boys nearly burned me alive and ended up changing my life. I don't have any home invasion stories per se because I'm homeless, or I guess they call it unhoused these days, because sure, that's the kind of thing people like me worry about nomenclature and word use now. Anyways, I'm being a bit flippant. I do get it. It's why I realize that I do have a home invasion story, even though you see I live in my car, and to me, that car is home. I've lived this kind of nomadic lifestyle for quite a few years, thanks to a combination of being down on my luck and also wanting to kind of stay off grid. I'm doing okay these days, so you and your listeners don't need to worry about me. And I love having Let's Read by my side in the cold or right now extremely hot nights while I camp out in my car. The night it all happened, I wasn't in my current ride. No. Back then I had a beat-up '87 Ford Fiesta, barely held together with duct tape, prayers, and a stubborn will. But it had one glorious feature most modern cars don't: a big, soft back seat where I could bundle into my sleeping bag and pretend the world wasn't so cold. It was the dead of winter, 2018, one of those unforgiving British nights when the wind bites through your clothes and you start to forget what warmth feels like. I was parked at the edge of a mostly forgotten lot somewhere inland, miles from the coast. I liked quiet places. No lights, no patrols, no awkward knocks on the window telling me to move along. That night, though, silence betrayed me. At first, I thought it was a dream. The sensation of motion, the low rumble of tires over gravel. But it got more violent. Bumps, swerves, a sharp turn. I was awake and not in control. I lay frozen under my layers. I didn't dare move. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought they'd hear it. Then I heard them. From under the sleeping bag, I heard 2 young-sounding voices. They were talking about taking the car for a joyride and having some quote-unquote fun in the fields. Apparently, they'd scored big by finding this abandoned car all by itself in the lot. Well, damn, I guess I'd been carjacked. Except I was still in the car, and they didn't know. They were kids. Teenagers or maybe uni students. Judging by the way they talked, more cocky than cruel. Still, they'd hot-wired a car and were taking it out like a stolen toy. I kept still, praying they wouldn't think to check the bags. I had the keys in my pocket, and I was always particular about ensuring the car was locked and the keys were on me before going to sleep. Hell, I normally didn't sleep in the back seat in case I needed to make a quick getaway, but it was so cold that I'd taken to doing it at the time. The roads got rougher. I could tell from the way my head knocked gently against the window that we were off the main path now. They were laughing, yelling over the sound of the engine and potholes. Then the laughter stopped. The car turned off onto something softer. Mud. I felt it in my bones as we bounced into a field. I thought of leaping out, just springing from the moving car like a stuntman. What if they saw me? What if they panicked? Or worse, what if they didn't stop? I was completely bloody terrified at the time. The more I wake up and my mind cleared, the more I realized what deep doo-doo I was in. They could crash and kill us all. Or maybe they'd turn around and realize, hey, the homeless chump who owns this car is still here, and we better not leave him alive to ID us. The Fiesta jerked to a stop. Shuntai. Then, doors slamming shut. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Good. Then came the shatter. I heard breaking glass and then smelled the smoke. No. Oh, I recognized the sharp bite of fuel. Not the subtle staleness of gas fumes, but raw accelerant. Someone had tossed a Molotov into the car. In the UK, apparently. It's not uncommon for kids to burn old cars after joyrides, sort of a twisted send-off. But this car wasn't empty. It was my home, my shelter. Now it was an oven. Flames were licking up the front passenger seat already as I tore my sleeping bags off and tried to open the back door. It was locked. I fumbled with the awkward manual lock and then began to panic. I banged on the window. My hands were shaking. The heat was rising. I could barely see through the thickening smoke. And then faces. This got the attention of the joyriders, and I finally saw them. They were gesturing to me, and it looked like they were talking frantically. For a moment, I thought they'd leave me there. Let the witness burn with the evidence, so to speak, but they didn't. They could have run, disappeared into the night and left me to burn. Instead, they ran toward the flames. One of them hurled a rock through the rear window, and the other reached in to pull me out. My lungs burned. My throat was raw, but I was alive. What followed was a panicked, tearful plea of contrition as the three of us ran from the field. None of us really wanting to have to deal with the cops. They were both from university, home for the holidays. They thought the car was abandoned. A mate told them it had been in the lot for weeks. They were horrified, not just by the fire, but by the fact they'd nearly killed someone. I believed them. I have never seen two kids more sick with guilt and worry. And while it caused me some short-term inconvenience, I don't regret my decision to write the car off and abandon it. The boys' families were incredible, kind and understanding, and they made sure things were and are right with me. We never called the police. There didn't seem much point. The car was gone, and no insurance agency in the world covers a homeless man's mobile shelter. But something strange happened in the weeks that followed. They kept checking in. First, to make sure I was okay. Then, to offer help, a place to shower, a bite to eat. Eventually, one of their families helped me get work again. Freelance design stuff on an old laptop they gifted me. We still talk. Sometimes over the phone, sometimes over a shared pint when I'm in town. And I never would have thought it. But from that nearly fatal night, I gained something I didn't know. It was a very happy ending to a story of extreme irresponsibility. But at the time, it was absolutely terrifying. They know I'm sending the story to you, and I think them and their family will get a kick out of it if you do actually run it. I've changed some details majorly, and it didn't really happen near Weston. We picked that location for a reason. We stay in touch to this day, and they've helped me more than I can ever express. But it's incredibly bizarre to think that I met these people by them stealing my home with me in it and driving me almost to my doom.